Welcome to the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. In the wake of the conversation with the DRC Finance Minister Nicolas Kazadi earlier, the Africa Center is back with its annual dialogue series during the Springs meeting here in the atrium of the IMF. With this program, we make sure that African views and voices will be heard, and we also do our best to advance the Africa's agenda in Washington, D.C. Now I'm happy to welcome Enoch Godongwana, Minister of Finance of South Africa since 2021. In these Atlantic Council studios, we have moved here. Mr. Minister, welcome to Washington, welcome to the IMF.
Thank you very much.
We have 30 minutes, a lot to say about your country, South Africa. If you allow me, I would like to organize this conversation in three parts. We can start with the economic situation of your country, and then we can move to your expectations with the IMF and World Bank, why you are in these spring meetings, and we'll close with a global conversation around the continental issues, the BRICS, and maybe, why not, the Bretton Woods reforms. So let's start with the current economic state of your country. Before this conversation, I was checking the numbers, and IMF and IFDB, for example, they have the same analysis. They mention the crippling power cuts, the volatile commodity prices, and the challenging external context. And all these elements have contributed to the country's weak growth performance. But some of them say that they expect growth to pick up again in 2024. Do you share this analysis, Mr. Minister?
Yes, I do. Let me just say, I mean, the point is that we've had stagnant growth for over a decade, and lastly, as a result of the power shortages and other related issues, but key, a common denominator has been the power shortages. And I can tell you now that the expectation and the outlook we were projecting over the next few years is an average of 1.6 per annum. But of course, that's not a great thing to celebrate in a developing economy. Developing economy has got to have bigger numbers than that.
You mentioned ESCOM, of course. So I guess you are going to address the problems related to the problems of mismanagement, anything, and this is a part of the policies you plan to have. Just a question about the general elections in May. Does this impact your economic plan in 2024? I mean, your policies, will they impact the populations, for example? Because it's about reducing the inflation, it's about controlling the deficit, the budget. So how do you plan to do this in a context of election?
Let me just say two things. We have not programmed our economic policy or the budget, for that matter, to be populist to deal with the electoral outcomes. That's the first thing I want to make. The second thing I want to make is that the population in South Africa will, of course, understand where this government comes from in terms of its impact on their lives. We can make a number of things. For instance, if us from 1994 to date, we're celebrating a 30 years, 3 decades of freedom.
Yes.
If you ask what are the key kind of achievement over those 3 decades, we can enumerate them. And South Africans are aware of those achievements.
Yeah, I know that the history is a very challenging context for a country like South Africa. But in the meantime, South Africa has been a leading economic country for the African continent. Do you think realistic to target this leading role again? Because Nigeria is now the most...
Target what?
To target the leading economic role in Africa. Now Nigeria is the first economy of the African continent. Do you still have this goal in mind?
Let me say, we have never had a goal that says we will be the biggest economy on the African continent. If we were to target that, we were to target a moving target, because demographics are in favor of Nigeria.
That's right.
Nigeria has got a bigger population. It got the potential to be the biggest economy on the African continent. What we must be targeting as South Africa? We are the most industrialized economy on the African continent. To what extent can we build on that and build competencies which will make us to be a stronger economy on the African continent? So we're not targeting size, we're targeting competencies which will make us to be a factor on the African continent.
Speaking of the African continent, the Atlantic Council hosted Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, a few days ago. And she said something that African economies remain resilient and with average growth projected to stabilize at 4.1% in 2023 and 2024, which is, according to the African Development Bank, the second fastest rate in the world.
Yeah.
How do you share this optimistic view about the entire African continent?
I do, for a number of reasons. The fact of the matter is that, and if you look at the number of countries that are growing global, the majority of them are on the African continent. Secondly, the African continent does not have the challenges of an aging population. The African continent has got a younger population, which makes us to be more competitive moving forward. And I share the optimism about the African continent moving forward.
So there is, however, there is something that makes me curious of your reaction. China. China is the trading partner of the African continent. The challenge is that the IMF forecasts that China will see 4.6% gross domestic product growth only, because Beijing targeted 5%. So do you think that the domestic problems in China will impact the trade and then the growth with the African continent?
There will be spillover effects because the Chinese are, by their very nature, the consumers of most of our commodities. And mostly Africa were commodity producers. To the extent that the Chinese will have a lower growth, that will have a spillover effect. Chapter 3 of the World Economic Outlook begins to show what that impact is, which they've published. Interesting enough is that if the spillover effects will come into what is called the SACO region, it shows if South Africa contracts, what is going to be the impact on the surrounding countries of South Africa.
About South Africa trades more with China than with any other country, right? Is it right? Yes, in the world. So I noticed that trade with China makes up roughly 24% of its total trade in goods. Can you say more about the impact of the Chinese problems on the South African economy?
Yeah, let me just make an important point. China does not consume our finished goods. If we were to look, for instance, whether it's automobiles that we sell to Japan, we sell to USA, we sell to Europe. So what China consumes are commodities in South Africa. To that extent that we're a major commodity producer, they take a lot of that. And therefore, any disruptions in the Chinese economy has got a knock-on effect on our commodities and our sector.
So this impact will be limited. The
increase
of funding of investment.
They've got a knock-on effect. If the mining sector is affected in South Africa, the mining sector consumes 40% of the steel, what is produced by the steel industry in South Africa. So that knock-on effect continues to other sectors.
So if we see things with a larger perspective, this brings me to the BRICS.
Yeah.
South Africa hosted the BRICS summit last summer.
Yeah.
It was the opportunity for the BRICS to welcome new members in
Yeah.
Africa, Ethiopia, and Egypt. And we know that the BRICS have, BRICS members have huge ambitions when it comes to strengthening their trade relations. So with the BRICS New Development Bank, for example. And you are here at the IMF, and next year you will host the G20. Can you tell us more about your geopolitical moves between the BRICS and the G20, not to mention the IMF? How does it work?
There's no tension between those. There's nothing different in creating regional blocks, except that the regional bloc we've created now is across continents. So BRICS is also more focused on developing economic relations between these countries than anything else. You will see if you read the Johannesburg Declaration, will show you the major areas of focus, which is largely around trade and economic cooperation. Similar things, with the G20. G20 is an important institution and it plays an important role in the transforming, particularly of the in multinational institutions. The shape and content of what comes out of the multinational development institutions, whether it's World Bank, the IMF, your French one, your German ones, and all of those things, largely influenced by the discussions with it. A key agenda which has been around in the G20 has been the reform of the international financial architecture, which is quite an important point. And secondly has been to concretize the global climate finance issues. Those are important debates which are taking place in the G20, and G20 is an important institution, and its decisions have been able to be effective. The debt relief, for instance, to the common framework for Africa has been an important development.
So for the G20, we will go back to the IMF and reforms, etc. But about the G20, can you tell us more about South Africa's vision or South Africa's roadmap for the next G20? You mentioned climate common framework, of course. Will this be your main roadmap, or do you plan to bring up other topics? And will you coordinate with your African counterparts before the G20 opens its doors?
Okay, two things.
There's a lot. There's a lot. I know.
Two things.
I know.
Let me just say, we are developing an agenda which we will pursue during our presidency. But that agenda must take into account this work which Brazil has put into place, which some of it is a carryover from other things. We've got to say how much of this we're going to carry over into other jurisdictions. For instance, we met the Americans today. They were saying they were also interested in understanding where we're heading to, because after us is going the USA.
Yes.
So they want to say, are there any things we can have a long-term agenda beyond South Africa and beyond the America?
Of course.
That's the first point in terms of the agenda. The second point is obviously every country takes into account its own continent. You will see, for instance, if you look at Indonesia, they took into account the area. India had an Asian focus. The Brazilians have got a Latin American kind of focus in it. We will inject an African perspective into that agenda, and we are going to have an interaction with our colleagues on the African continent.
Just, I'm curious about one of the major BRICS goals, the BRICS currency. around the question of de-dollarization. So this is really something that intrigues me. What is the agenda of the BRICS currency?
Is there any document of BRICS which talks about the BRICS currency?
We read the newspapers. I mean, I'm not saying that it's in your coming roadmap. I don't know about South Africa. That's the question.
No. I'm saying precisely because we had a number of people talking about the BRICS currency and so on. To my knowledge, there's never been a discussion about the BRIC currency. It does not exist.
So why everybody's talking about
it does not even exist on our documents, on our declarations.
So it's not a project.
It's what is there. What is there are two things. The first one is to say we must begin to pay each other in terms of local currencies. In other words, there's not, which we do. I mean, in my neighbors of Botswana, I'm not paying them in dollars, I'm paying them in rands. So they are willing to accept rands as well. So if I'm dealing with the Chinese, there's no reason they cannot accept my rand. All we're talking about is recognizing common local currencies when we trade amongst each other. That's the first thing. Another thing which the central bankers are dealing with is a payment system. So these BRIC currencies, like I read about it when
everywhere.
I mean, let me just tell you, I mean, the Chinese have got a strong currency, the renminbi. And they've got ambitions of getting that currency being a reserve currency. Why would they leave that ambition in the interest of an abstract notion of a BRICS currency?
Okay, so this is good to know, and which leads me to the possibility that other players play an important role in Africa now that China is reducing its investments on the continent. I was thinking of India, for example, that is a major partner and even a cultural partner for South Africa. Also Turkey and many other global powers or regional powers interested on the African continent. How do you see, and not to mention Russia, how do you see the role of these regional or global powers in their relationship with South Africa and more globally with the African continent? Is it about having just options, or are they trying to build an alternative system to the Bretton Woods system?
Countries have got what is called their national interests in their geopolitical strategies. No country does not have that. In the investment space, countries invest with that in the back of their mind. So we welcome any investment on the African continent on one condition, that investment is not going to undermine the sovereignty of our countries. In other words, you are not going to invest in my country and say, I can only deal only with you. I don't, whether it's China or Russia or anybody or USA. Our major investment, I mean, I'm taking South Africa, our exposure is largely with Chinese on commodities. On all other products is the Western economies.
So we often hear that the BRICS would not be so, more attractive to the African countries if the international financial system or architecture worked well. So, and you know that the IMF and World Bank have engaged under the US leadership some reforms of the Bretton Woods system in order to make it more maybe fair to the South. In Marrakesh, where the Atlantic Council was a few months ago, it has been decided that there will be a creation of a 25th chair on the IMF Executive Board for Sub-Saharan Africa to improve its voice and representation. So your reaction about the governance of this system. What do you think about the first steps of this engagement for the reform?
There's a history to the formation of the Bretton Woods institutions. And that history, although some of it may not be written, is anecdotal, was that the World Bank will be led by the USA, and the IMF will be led by the Europeans, and that still exists. So that's the first point you must make.
And you think it should change?
I think it should. I think it should. That's what the reform should be about of the Bretton Woods institution. It's not only about the financial architecture, it's also about the governance.
Exactly, but beyond the governance, there is also the funding. You mentioned climate as an important topic of work under your presidency of the next G20. And the funding is a major challenge. Africans cannot find a way to fund the COVID crisis, the pandemic, the climate challenges, etc. So what kind of reforms should be engaged to answer, to address this important question of funding? Just for your awareness, Mr. Minister, the Africa Center will publish in 2 days an important report with policy recommendations about the reform of the Bretton Woods system with an African perspective. Yeah. So about the funding, how things can be done and how can we better include the private sector?
You know, a German economist, Friedrich List, who grew up in the USA during Alexander Hamilton's time as Secretary Treasurer, makes the point in his book, Friedrich List, that it's easy for those who have grown up through a particular ladder, and once they get to the top, they kick the ladder away. Now, when you discuss climate finance, you must start from that kicking away of the ladder. The developed world has polluted the world as part of their growth trajectory. And then they are then saying, now that we have reached the top, we would require that everybody else don't use the similar route for growth. And the developing world has said, okay, fine. If that's the case, if that is the case, we've got to do about the funding mechanism to avoid this calamity of climate change. The developed world has made promises over the years.
Yeah.
So the key question is, how do we, everybody's committed to do climate change and climate finance. The resources sit with the developed world, and they were the ones who polluted. Can we find a better mechanism of transferring these resources? One of the instruments we're talking about was the special drawing rights.
Yeah.
Right? Can they be utilized for a similar purposes? Not only should we talk about mitigation, we also talk about adaptation. So those issues are all of them on the table in our debate with the developed world.
And during your stay here, during these spring meetings, that will be your main message?
My message is slightly nuanced because you know, the major problem people are debating is about how to get Africa out of debt. And if you can track from Senegal or any other country and said, how many times have this country gone through a debt challenge?
Yeah.
So the problem is not debt. The problem is the capacity of this economy to service their debt. And what that means, we've got a growth challenge on the African continent. That's a discourse and conversation we should be having.
Yeah, and the interest payment, I guess, the rating agencies,
Yeah.
I guess. Many topics that could be raised because the African debt is not so high,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The interests are.
Yeah. That's
so-
precisely the point. The debt itself as a percentage of GDP is not necessarily high.
Yeah.
But the economies are not growing insufficient enough to be able to service that debt.
Exactly.
So that's why you have got to have as a major focus the growth issue as a growth challenge.
Yeah, I was reading a paper from the Afreximbank who said that African countries borrow on average at rates nearly 4 times higher than those of the United States
Yeah.
and nearly 8 times higher than those of Germany.
Yeah.
You know, so there is some work to do to convince the agencies to change their policy to Africa, I guess. But
Yeah.
much more than that, maybe the partners too. So now I would like, maybe we have like 4 minutes, and I would like to dive into something that is undermined in the policy conversations. It is the industrial transformation, industrial transformation.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the IMF, the World Bank, everybody can reform everything. A part of the answer is in the African hands, right? And my first question is about the industrial policy. We have remarkable examples in Africa: Morocco, Egypt, Ethiopia, Mauritius with textiles, Kenya with agribusiness, Nigeria with electronics, who try to build an industrial policy. So my question is, what kind of industrial policy South Africa is building? What kind of specialization do you have that can make the country so competitive that we can see the outcomes in terms of value chains, for example? This is something that belongs to the South African and national vision, right?
We are developing an industrial policy in a changing world. In an environment where machines are doing work and are producing goods. In other words, we're developing industrial policy in a technological changing environment.
That's right.
And as we develop our policy, we're taking those into account. And an example, we have 7 car manufacturers in South Africa.
7.
7. Now, that industry is changing because as they change, even the car, the engine is changing. You're going to have now a battery to do that. And the technology associated with that base, which requires specific critical minerals. So I'm using that industry as a case in point. We've cast our eyes squarely on that. And in addition to that, to say, what are the key critical minerals what are required to play in that space? And the interesting thing is that all of them, we have them in SADC. What that's going to require, we cannot have an industrial policy as South Africa outside a regional thinking. Regional thinking. How do we, as SADC, for instance, utilize and combine these minerals to achieve this objective? I'm just using that as a case in point,
As an example.
the automobile industry and its value chain. Yeah.
So I think I will be under pressure in a few seconds. So I'd love to have time to discuss about the business environment, tax incentives, industrial zones, and also agriculture and job creation. That is the heart of, I mean, at the end of the day, that's the goal, right?
Yeah.
Beyond the monetary policy, beyond the currencies thing, etc. That is the goal. So maybe next time we'll continue this conversation. Why not on the occasion of the G20 presidency by South Africa? But Mr. Minister, I would like to thank you to leave in your hands the last word of this conversation.
Yes.
Yes?
No. The last word on this conversation is that we are hard at work in South Africa. Our policy environment, we've instituted certain structural reforms in certain key sectors such as electricity, such as logistics, important structural reforms which are intended to crowd in private sector. Those areas used to be monopoly areas, where now we're introducing those changes. Our fiscal space, although constrained, we quite confident that we, on top of the debt situation, we achieved fiscal sustainability, and for the first time over a period, we've managed to achieve a primary surplus, which will impact on our total stock of debt. So we are on top of our game.
Yeah, and we wish you the best for South Africa and for yourself.
Thank you very
Mr.
much.
Minister. It was a pleasure to welcome you at the Atlantic Council here at the heart of the IMF building.
Yeah.
For our audience, thank you for watching. We'll be happy to see you next Friday, for the Africa Center. We will launch our new report on the reforms of the international financial architecture by our authors at the Africa Center in partnership with the Policy Center for the New South. And tomorrow we'll host as well President Macky Sall of Senegal. So thank you very much for watching, and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.